Welcome, one and all, to the Hammer Territory Podcast. My name is Shawn Coleman. Hope wherever you are and wherever you are listening, you are having a great week so far. Yes, I'll be honest, it is a bit disappointing and depressing to see playoff baseball and how awesome playoff baseball has been so far. It's not so much fun to see it without the Atlanta Braves, but that doesn't mean that there's not things that are worth talking about. And we finally got the news many of us had been waiting to hear. A very significant first domino to fall for the Braves offseason in many more ways than one. And we are here to break it all down for you on the Hammer Territory Podcast. And you know that it is a special podcast when we have the three-man show here with you. Scott Coleman and Stephen Tolbert are here with me. Scott, good as always to talk with you, sir. Hope you've been well. Glad to talk some Braves baseball with you.
Absolutely, Shawn. And this was a big day for the Atlanta Braves franchise. Because if you think about it, Bobby Cox, Freddie Gonzalez, Brian Snitker, and those are the only men to manage the Braves for the past 30 plus years at this point. And I truly didn't know what the decision was going to be today. We had an inkling that all season long, our feeling was that Brian Snitker, this was his last year, that he was going to retire. But as we got deeper and deeper and deeper into the regular season, and there was no announcement of any kind, and you start reading the quotes from people around the team, and it was like, maybe they are going to bring Snit back for one more year. Of course, if folks did not hear the news already, Brian Snitker is officially no longer the Braves manager. He is not retiring. He is going to transition into a front office role. But Stephen, what was your big takeaway today? Because obviously the $1 million question for weeks at this point, months, was will Brian Snitker be back in 2026? And now we know definitively the Braves are going to have a new manager.
Yeah, so obviously this is news we've been waiting on. And, I kind of blame Snit a little bit over the last 3 or 4 weeks for kind of throwing a wrench into what we thought was happening. All season long, it really wasn't even that much of a conversation. We would mention it every once in a while, but the assumption was just he was going to retire at the end of the year. Everybody we talked to, on the record, off the record, behind the scenes, no one had Snit coming back next year. Everyone just assumed he was retiring. And then in the last month, and Brad and I remember this was when you were gone, Scott. He actually made a comment yeah, we've got unfinished business. It was so jarringly different than what we had heard all season that Brad and I actually led a show for 30 minutes talking about this, because it just turned a complete 180 of no, we've got unfinished business. I don't like this being the last taste in my mouth of being a manager. We want to get back and do this thing right. And it really felt okay, well, maybe they have flipped. And then we had to go through the whole, he's not actually under contract. It might not be up to him. And we'll get into that stuff as we go here tonight. So yeah, it was finality in a weird way, because it was exactly what we thought was going to happen. But the road we took to get there was a bit circuitous. And I think Snit was having some cold feet, quite honestly. I think he talked about that a lot in his press conference about how he had to get away for a couple days to really decide, this is what I want to do. While he was in it, he really couldn't decide. And so we finally it's just finality. Now we know he's done as manager. The Braves are going to have a new manager. In the last 8 years, they've had more stadiums than managers. They have been incredibly consistent at that spot. Like Scott just said, for the last 30 years, there's been 3 guys. So it is going to be a wild change. It's going to be an interesting search. But the first half of the show, we're going to spend talking about Snit. Snit deserves some flowers here, and we're going to spend a chunk of tonight's show talking about him. And then the second half of the show, we'll do some options they have going forward.
And I think that it's important to establish that. I think, I know, Scott, you and Brad talked about it last night, that, the handling of this probably could have been better, definitely could have as time went on. I know Snit probably from all parties involved, there probably was, some back and forth on what made the most sense. But at the end of the day, the right decision was made, for Snitker as well as the Braves organization, because the timing was right. This was the time for us to go in a different direction. Brian Snitker's time as Braves manager had run its course. That, I think, is established, and that's known. But that doesn't mean that just because it run its course, doesn't mean that, yes, there were struggles more towards the end, but the success far outweighed the struggles. And I want to, go beyond just, just talking about the fact that the Braves have had only 3 managers over the past 30 plus years. I think that it's not far-fetched. I don't think it's wrong to say Brian Snitker is arguably the second most impactful non-player on this Braves organization over the past century. Like, I think that, or at least the time in Atlanta, I think that that's fair to say. Second most wins. Him and Bobby Cox are the only ones to lead us to the World Series. But I think also what really needs to be highlighted is, I know that Brian Snitker, he's been with the organization for 50 years. Only the last fifth of that has been as manager of the Braves. We're talking about more than half of his managerial career with the Braves was in the minor leagues. When Bobby Cox and all the players were having their success in the majors, Brian Snitker was playing a pivotal role in helping groom our young players to keep that streak alive in the minors. That's how important of a role Brian Snitker has played in this organization now for 5 decades. And there's more that I want to say, and it will come back around to me. But I just want to make that point, is that we're not just talking about Brian Snitker's impact being right now at the major league level. We're talking about the fact that Brian Snitker played a major role in that 90s and 2000s run, helping to continue those channels of young, successful players coming up by what he did for them in the minors.
Yeah. You think about just the sheer number of players that had Brian Snitker as their coach or as their manager over the decades. I mean, it's hundreds, hell, it's probably thousands at this point. And that is such a rare thing to be able to say. And everything about Brian Snitker becoming a World Series winning manager was unconventional and unlikely. I mean, this guy was a minor league lifer, finally got a chance to come up to the majors and be a coach, but never anywhere near the manager's job. And truthfully, there's only 30 big league manager jobs. But the Atlanta Braves in early 2016 was about as bad of a job as there was in the majors. And maybe at the time, the front office, it was kind of like throwing Snit a bone. He was a professional. He was going to command the clubhouse. But, I mean, dear God, there was zero talent on that roster when Snit came up. And I think it speaks volumes to Brian Snitker, his character and the man he is, that even in a year where the Braves were just god-awful, lost 100 games, no prayer, we're still a while away from being able to contend, that when Snit's interim deal was up, all the players campaigned for Brian Snitker to become the full-time manager, and he was rewarded with 6 straight divisions, a World Series championship, 7 playoff appearances. I mean, it was kind of a storybook, Disney type of story for Snit, and he deserves it, and I'm glad that he can now spend more time with his family and get away from the game. I'm also glad that he's still going to be around the organization, because does he have some holes as a manager, as an in-game tactician? Sure. We've talked about him on this podcast for years, but he deserves everything that's coming his way. And just a special story, quite honestly.
Yeah. And it's so if you guys remember, so the Braves fired Freddie Gonzalez in May of 2016. It was like May 15th or something like that. They also at the time fired his bench coach. I don't know if you guys remember that. I think it was like Carlos Tosca was his name. They fired the bench coach at the exact same time that they fired Freddie Gonzalez. And that's notable because oftentimes the bench coach is the guy that you would turn to for an interim job. If you've just fired the manager, you don't want to do a full search in season. You kind of turn to the bench coach, let him do the rest of the year, and then you hire your new guy. So I was just thinking about it today. Like, what if they hadn't have fired the bench coach at the same time? Like, Snit might have never gotten the interim job. And we know for a fact that the only reason he got the full-time job was because the players fell in love with him while he was the interim manager. So it is funny to think back, like if they had just fired Freddie Gonzalez and not the bench coach at the time, like how different Braves history could be. And that's, Snit basically getting a 4-month job and just winning over the entire clubhouse is pretty indicative of just who Snit is. Like,
yeah,
because he was never a great tactician as a manager. He was never it was never his strong suit. So how does a guy like that keep this job and excel at this job for a decade? And Sean said, even longer if you count his minor league managerial stints. It's because he was beloved by players. He garnered so much respect in that clubhouse because he was extremely honest. He was extremely fair. He was very single-minded in that we're just trying to win. I'm just trying to win. And every day he could just say, I'm just trying to win. Did I agree with all the stuff he did in efforts to win games? Absolutely not. And we spent a lot of time on this podcast loudly disagreeing with things that he did. But he could always look players in the eye and say, I'm just trying to win. That's why I made the decision I made. And they would have to respect it. He played. He's been in the organization for 50 years. You had no choice but to just have supreme respect for the guy. And that's how you manage a clubhouse for 7-8 months a year without the whole thing coming off the rails. Is the entire clubhouse respects you. It is the most important part of managing by far. There's no way to quantify it. There's no way to measure it, but far and away, the most important part of this job is having the respect of everybody in that clubhouse so that you can keep it on the rails when times get tough over a 6-month season. And that's what he was great at. That's what I'll remember him for. I'm not going to remember the mind-numbing bullpen decisions or leaving Bryce Elder. I will remember leaving Bryce Elder in a playoff game. But besides that, I will remember the fact that this man, he gained so much respect from his players. And that's how he accomplished what he accomplished. And it's a good lesson looking forward as we talk about the new manager. And we'll do that at the end of the show. Like, what the most important qualities are of a manager is, do you have the respect of that clubhouse? Because if you do, you can accomplish a lot. And if you don't, you can accomplish nothing. And he had ultimate respect from his players. And that's kind of his legacy, in my opinion.
I think the best compliment that can be offered to a leader of people, whether it be a manager or boss, whomever, is if outside sources and the people that you're leading themselves, if an assessment of the group that you're leading is that that group wants to be at their best for the person that's leading them consistently, that right there shows how good of a leader that leader is. Stephen, you said what I had been. I'll be honest with you. On my ride home, I have about a 45-minute ride home from my day job each day, and I was trying to put together the words. And Stephen, you said it more beautifully than I could have. But that's the best way that I could have summed it up, is that Brian Snitker, you can honestly say his players year in and year out wanted to be at their best for him because of the person that he was. Because so many people out of obligation act like they care, act like they're loyal, so on and so forth. With Brian Snitker, you could clearly tell it was sincere. And that's what made him so effective with his honesty, because anytime he was honest with one of his players, they knew that he was being honest to try to make them better, and because he wanted to win. And that's what matters. And to Stephen's point about that being, for all the areas where, Snitker could have improved or struggled, the one strength that he had of relating to people because of how genuine he was, that by far was more impactful than any of his struggles. Because when you work with as talented of rosters as he did, getting those talents to want to perform at their best for you is what will allow for you to be consistent, is what will allow for continuity. And that really stands out. So could not agree with Stephen more. Similar to how Bobby Cox was, being a leader of men, being a player's coach, being someone that can relate to players that players wanted to play for. That's what stands out as the reason why Brian Snitker was so successful. And isn't it funny that we're talking about this 3 decades later, was what was successful for Cox back in the 90s has been what's been successful for Snitker in the 2020s. It doesn't change. The better you relate to the players that you lead, the more likely you're going to be able to have success. And he certainly had that. The other thing that I'll say to that is that I think that it's fun to also, Scott, you talked about the fact that when he was an interim coach, people spoke up for him, wanting him to get the main managerial role as time went on. I think it also says a lot to Snit that 2 of the players who talked about him wanting to retain his job in the next year are Chris Sale, who was with him for all of 2 years, and Drake Baldwin, who's been a rookie this year. That goes to show that it doesn't matter how long you were with Snit, that's how impactful it is. And I think that it's fun to end this segment on discussing Snit and remembering him, given a story or a moment that really stood out to you during during his time. For me, guys, what stood out was really the first opportunity where we as Braves country realized just how important this roster meant to Snitker. And that was when he went out. When Ronald Acuna Jr. got hit by Jose Urena in the game against the Marlins, Snitker's immediate response, going out there and acting out of character, immediately going out there and showing, I am not going to take this, you going after one of my players, that really let us know this is kind of like a father figure. Brian Snitker always saw this roster as kind of his kids. That lets you know how much he cared about the roster. That got Braves country behind Snitker if they already weren't. That was kind of the, this guy really is the perfect leader for us to be where we want to get. That was the moment that stood out for me.
Yeah. Well, and not only that moment, because that moment did come to mind, Shawn, but after the game, when he was meeting with the media, Snit got emotional talking about the players and said, those are my kids, and had to fight back tears and got choked up. And I thought that really spoke to just the character of Snit and just how much he genuinely cared. And that was something he said today in his press conference when the players, there were about a dozen current Braves there. And he said, this being with these guys was the greatest part of my job. And just the camaraderie, being in that clubhouse, being in the dugout for 7 months. I mean, these guys see each other more than they see their wives, their girlfriends, their kids. I mean, that is their family for 7 months out of the year, sometimes 8 if you make a deep run into the playoffs. The other moment, too, that just comes to mind was just the absolute elation that was on Snit's face when they won the World Series, in the dugout, getting dogpiled by Walt Weiss and Eric Young and Ron Washington, and then getting to host that trophy. It's just, that's what it's all about. And again, it's just kind of a storybook ending for a guy who paid all of his dues. So many opportunities, I'm sure, came in Snit's head where he's like, you know what? I just don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to do the bus rides in the minor leagues. I haven't gotten my chance. I'm done. He stuck with it. And at the end of the day, he got to do something that's pretty damn cool. Won a ton of baseball games, won a World Series. A pretty special baseball career.
Yeah. And mine's not a moment. Mine is along the lines of what Scott just said, but this dude managed in the minor leagues for years and years and years, where you get zero recognition, you get very little money, you have to love baseball and you have to love the organization you're with to just sit in AAA or AA and ride the bus and watch all your best players leave after half a year, and all the nonsense that minor league, you hear a lot about minor league players and all the stuff they have to put up with. We don't ever talk about the minor league coaches and what they have to put up with no hope of being called up. Like they're there for the whole year. And Snit did this for forever. And I know he was the third base coach for a little while for Bobby, but he was a massive part of the Braves minor league system for decades. And, again, to get his shot like that and to take advantage of it to the point where when Alex came in 2017, people remember John Coppolella had the big scandal at the end of 2017, resigned. Braves bring in Alex Anthopoulos. Everybody thought he was going to hire his own manager, because that's what you do when you go to a new job. You hire your own guy. The Braves had given Snit the full-time job in 2017, but had not made any guarantees for anything, obviously, with a new front office. Nobody would have blamed Alex for hiring his own manager. And Alex talked about it today. He saw how much the players respected Snit, and he was like, I don't need another. I can win with a guy who's this respected. Is he the best tactician? No. Is he the best bullpen guy? No. But I can win with a guy this respected. And, listen to him talk today about how it's all about the players. Somebody asked him, Snit, the fans would have loved to give you like a 1-month send-off if you had just announced this last month. And it was like, yeah, that was my call. I just didn't want to do it. It was all about the players. I just did not want to do it. You can blame me because you didn't get to do that, but I didn't want to do it. He is 1,000% about the players. And I love that. And that's exactly what you need as a manager. You have to take your ego entirely out of it And that's another thing that I'll remember, is that he had to drop his ego from his entire persona for years living in the minors. I mean, you're invisible. You're a ghost. Only people that know about you are people deep in the organization and no one else. And that means you are not at all prideful. You are literally 100% about the team, about the organization. And that's the same attitude he carried once he got the big job. And that's why players love him so much. And that's why I'll miss him. I will miss Snit. I don't know how you feel, Scott. I'm completely okay with this decision. I don't know if it was his decision or the Braves' decision, but I'm okay with moving on. I think it's the right time. But Snit was a great manager. And there's going to be a lot of people who hated Snit. I'm just telling you, the grass is not always greener with a new guy. And I hope people appreciate what they just had for the last decade, the stability they just had for the last decade, the success they just had for the last decade, because it's not a given. And there's plenty of managers who come into that job and they get eaten alive by the pressure of having to manage a clubhouse of that many rich personalities for that long. And he did it marvelously. Hats off to you, Snit. Enjoy your retirement. I'm fine with the move, but I'm going to miss Brian Snitker.
Yeah, I will too. I mean, just a great man, a really good manager. I think we've talked about just the respect that he commanded from 26 millionaires 7 months at a time and kept the team together. There was very, very rarely any kind of off-field drama with the Braves. You know, you're right. The grass is not always greener. I do think this was probably time to move on from Snit. It just feels like it's the right time. But truthfully, boys, if they announced this morning that Snit was coming back for one more year and it was going to be one final ride, I would not have come on this podcast like banging my fists on the table, screaming what they're doing, because there were legitimate reasons to potentially bring Snit back. And now we go into a new era of Braves baseball.
Yeah, and I'll say, and Brad, I'll make this point for Brad because he's not here. The process was weird. I didn't understand the process they used. The whole lame duck thing this year, I didn't love that. I thought there was a better way to handle it. I would have loved if they had been able to convince him to let fans kind of appreciate him for a month. I do think there were better ways to handle it, but where we ended up, I think is fine. Obviously, who they get next is going to be a big question, but Brian Snitker, go enjoy retirement. You got a new truck. I love the fact that they gave him a new truck. They gave him an all paid expenses trip to Hawaii. I made the joke on Twitter. It's like he won the Price is Right showcase. Like, just a awesome career. Great job. Hats off. Go enjoy retirement. And obviously he's still taking the job in the front office. We'll still see him around. He mentioned today it's the exact same job that Bobby Cox had when he moved on to the front office. So that's pretty cool. So you'll still see him around. But as far as manager, no more manager. Great job, Snit.
Yeah, and it's just, and of course, he's going more than deserving. He will be inducted into the Braves Franchise Hall of Fame next year as well. But just next year also will be the 50th year that he's with the Braves organization. I mean, since 1976. I mean, Snitker started with the Braves organization 10 years after they moved to Atlanta. That's how long he's been with the organization. If you've been with an organization for 50 years, you've done two things. You've done things the right way, and you've done them in a highly successful manner. And I think that that's a great way to describe Brian Snitker, short and sweet. Thank you, Brian Snitker. Best of luck to you, and a salute to you on a great career as Braves manager. But of course, as they say, the show goes on, and we've got plenty to discuss when it comes to what the new era, which we're hoping will very much be like the Snitker era of the Braves. What will the new Braves era look like with a new voice at the helm of the roster? We'll discuss that in just a moment after a word from our partners.
Football is back, and so is your shot at big wins. With DraftKings Pick Six, the official daily fantasy partner of the NFL, your game day instincts can score you real money fast. Here's the play. Just pick more or less on two or more player stats, or break out rookies to elite QBs, and unlock the upside that every snap brings. The better your calls, the bigger your payout. And here's the kickoff bonus. New DraftKings customers get $50 in bonus picks with just a $5 entry on your first pick set. This season, play your player instincts. Download DraftKings Pick Six app right now and use code FOUL. That's code FOUL. Play just $5, get $50 in Pick Six bonus picks. Make the call, ride the upside in partnership with DraftKings Pick Six. The crown is yours.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 and over. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick Six not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. One per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick Six bonus picks that expire in 14 days. Limited time offer. See terms at picksix.draftkings.com/promos.
So, guys, I think it's important to kind of, set the stage on this is a rather unique setup when it comes to an organization looking for a new leader for their roster. And what I mean by that is this, is that, yes, the Braves are not in the playoffs. They had a losing record. They have high draft odds next year. A lot of those characteristics you look at, and you think, okay, this team's kind of maybe entering a rebuild mode. That's not the case at all. This is a team with a roster that still feels it's in its contention window, and they expect to be a contender next year. So with that in mind, there's some different dynamics about this potential search, about finding that next guy to lead the roster that are here for the Braves, that make this a bit unique, that are not always there, when it comes to teams rebuilding. So it's about the process. It's about the names, but at the end of the day, it's keeping that focus on the fact we want to win now, and we want to win now at a big time level. So with that in mind, Stephen, let's talk about that process. Let's talk about, is this a short process? Is this a long drawn out process? What about the current setup with the current coaches beyond manager? What does this process look like in your mind before we get into some of the names that could potentially be discussed?
Yeah, so obviously, now that it's, we know that there's going to be a new manager, you start putting the calls out, right? So we'll get into the names, but the first thing Alex is going to have to do is going to have to figure out the contract status of all the coaches on the staff. Because, obviously everybody was concentrating on Snit, but now that you're going to have a new manager, if Walt Weiss, for instance, doesn't get this job, he might want to move somewhere else. Kranitz might want to move somewhere else. They might not want to work with a new manager. You do this knowing very well that you might have to replace most, if not all, of your staff, which is why teams do it so early. There's a reason that the day after the season, Monday morning, you saw so many of these decisions coming down. There was a reason that Brad was like, I can't believe they haven't done anything. And it's, Tuesday night. It's because there is an urgency to this process, because you're not only potentially replacing your manager, you are potentially replacing your entire coaching staff if other guys move on. Now, those guys have contracts too, and we're not privy to that information, but there's just a chance that they're going to have to, they're going to have to hire more than just a manager. So, in baseball, you do have to, one thing we talked about offline today was, in the NFL, there's the Rooney Rule about how many guys you need to interview, minority candidates you need to interview. Baseball does have something similar. It's not exactly the same. It doesn't work exactly the same, but this can't just be like Alex picks up the phone, calls David Ross and says, hey, I want you to be my new manager. And we're not going to get an announcement tomorrow on who the new manager is. This is going to be a process. They do set up interviews. They'll set up a bunch of interviews. I'm guessing I think it'll be an exhaustive search, and it's not just going to be an exhaustive search just for appearance sake. I think Alex wants to do an exhaustive search. I know Brad and Scott talked about this on their show on Sunday. He hasn't had to do this with the Braves yet. He hasn't had to pick a manager. The Braves have not gone through one of these exhaustive searches in a long time. And so I think they're going to turn over a bunch of different leaves, a bunch of different rocks. I think they're going to interview some maybe out of the box candidates. I know DLB brought up some interesting names that we'll get to, but I do think this will be a little bit of a process, which is why it was so important to go ahead and start it, because it could take a while. And again, you might have to add pitching coach, hitting coach. There was already questions about Tim Hires anyways, bench coach. What does Walt Weiss do? This is the beginning of this process. It is not the end.
Yep. And I will say the good news is this Braves job, I have to imagine, is very attractive to the eyes of basically everybody in baseball.
Yeah.
Might honestly be a fun segment of what are the top 5 managerial jobs when you consider all factors. But for this Braves team, I know they had a down year this past season, but a very talented roster. You guys, you can turn on a playoff game right now and you look at the lineup and you look at some of the guys making starts, and it's man alive. If the Braves, if a few things went differently, the Braves have more talent on their rosters than a lot of these playoff teams do. Of course, they have to perform like they're supposed to perform, but it is a organization of stability. I would imagine that Alex Anthopoulos is viewed as a good boss to work for.
Yeah.
Ownership, for better or worse, is not overly hands-on. Even though the Braves were cheap last offseason, they were still, I believe, 7th in payroll this last year. So this is not a situation where like the Baltimore Orioles job might be up, like the cheap asses who run the Orioles or the Marlins. Like how you going to draw a good candidate to manage the Marlins with a $50 million payroll?
Yeah.
So good roster, talent in place, a lot of guys in their prime, an organization of stability, good leadership, presumably money to spend this offseason. There's a lot of things working in the Braves' favor, and they should have a nice group of candidates to pick from, because they're not going to be scraping the bottom of the barrel begging for someone to take this job.
But the thing else, go ahead, Stephen.
Well, I was going to say, it's also an iconic franchise. Like the Braves are just an iconic brand and a massive fan base. Being the manager of the Atlanta Braves is a big deal in this sport. And I know we don't always think about the Braves in those terms because, you know, the Yankees and the Dodgers and like these massive, massive payroll teams get a lot of the headlines, but the Braves are a massive brand in the sport. Atlanta is one of the biggest markets in the country. The fan base is national because of TBS Superstation days. Like, it is a big deal to be the manager of this organization. And that is one, what Scott is talking about, why other people are going to be interested. So many other people are going to be interested in the job. And two, if you're Alex, why you have to do an exhaustive search, because you can't get this wrong. It's even though manager is not the same as, you know, head coach or coach in the NBA, coach in the NFL, you don't want to get this wrong. So this is going to be I think this is going to be a process, but Scott is 100% right. There will be tons of people interested in this job.
Last week, I had the pleasure of interviewing, former Brave and Major League outfielder Kevin Pillar. And Kevin Pillar was here for literally a year. And he came back to the same thing for nearly every question that I asked him. There's not really any specific secret sauce or anything like that the Braves do differently from other organizations. There's just so much goodness in the Braves organization. Good people, no matter where you go, from the front office to Snitker to the clubhouse, all those things exist. And yes, making a managerial change is changing a critical component, but that is one thing. But as we get into the names, that I think also needs to be addressed, with as much good as there is with the Braves organization, talent, continuity, stability, what have you, it's time for a change. A strength of theirs 2 years ago, continuity was a strength of theirs 2 years ago when we were successful, but it's now time to where there's a change. And it makes sense that a new voice probably comes in and maybe changes around how things are done a bit, keeping the good things that are there, but changing up areas where they can improve. And I definitely think that that's something Alex is going to put value on. What about my potential new hire? How does he do things differently that could be more effective, that over the past couple of years have kind of run stale? And so I think that that's really going to be a focus of Alex's as well. And Scott, let's get into it. Let's look at some of these names. We'll go through some names, kind of mention as to why they make sense. And then after that, we'll kind of start weeding through the names as to what really makes sense for Alex to value, to come to maybe, 2 or 3 who really stand out as being the best potential candidates for the job.
So that was like the big question today, of course, was, okay, who are the candidates for this job? And I think there are some obvious ones, and we're going to talk about them in one moment. And then I'm sure Alex is going to interview players that not a soul on earth writes about, talks about, thinks about. That's just the way it is. Alex knows people. He's been around the game for 25 years professionally. He's going to have people in mind that none of us are going to come up with. But because of that, we kind of sleuthed around today and tried to find a handful of possibilities. Let's just go through them. And then, Steven, if you want to pick a couple or even just one at a time, but I think probably let's go internal first. Walt Weiss, the current Braves bench coach, the right-hand man for Brian Snitker. Almost certainly Walt Weiss is going to get an interview. David Ross is a name that maybe was said the most today. David Ross had a piece with Ken Rosenthal in The Athletic that Ross is looking to manage kind of got a rough deal with the Cubs when they brought in Craig Counsell. He sat through a lot of bad baseball, and then the Cubs started getting better, and they kicked David Ross outside. So, former player, has managerial experience in a big market in a similar type of high-profile job. Skip Schumacher's name is very hot, although we will say Skip Schumacher is currently a heavy lean to take the Rangers open vacancy, but I'm guessing Alex will do his due diligence. Eric Young Sr. is, of course, has ties to the Braves, former first base coach, and I believe, and has been around the game. Mark DeRosa is currently with MLB Network, has managed Team USA. For my whole life, guys, I feel like Mark DeRosa has been said as a possible managerial candidate for the Braves. We will see. And lastly, a name that David O'Brien of The Athletic mentioned was Ryan Flaherty, who is the current Cubs bench coach and was a utility infielder for the Braves a few years ago. So again, David Ross, Skip Schumacher, Eric Young Sr., Mark DeRosa, Walt Weiss, and Ryan Flaherty. There are going to be more, but I guess of that group, Steven, I mean, do any of those names really kind of stick out in your mind?
Yeah, so let's go through them real quick. So Walt Weiss. So obviously Walt's been the Braves bench coach. I don't know if people know this, but like Walt Weiss has been there for like 9 years. Like he came almost immediately. And anytime you've been the bench coach for that long, and I was talking about this earlier when they fired Freddie Gonzalez and the bench coach, like the bench coach is like the automatic guy who's going to get looked at. Walt Weiss has managed before. He was the Rockies manager. He played in the majors, obviously played for the Braves. Like it checks a lot of boxes that are just natural. Now, there are a lot of people who are going to say, if you're making a change from Brian Snitker, maybe don't go hire his bench coach because it's just going to be Brian Snitker again. And that's a fair argument, and I would probably make that argument. But Walt Weiss's name is going to come up, and rightfully so. He at the very least needs an interview. You got to be respectful and give it, even if you don't want to hire him, you got to give him an interview. David Ross. Now, this is, if I had to set betting lines, if I had to set a betting line for the search, this is the guy I'm putting at the heavy favorite. So obviously David Ross, former catcher, a lot, he's kind of the like out of central casting former catcher that turns MLB manager. It's a very sought after kind of like archetype of, catchers are often sought, kind of considered the smartest guys on the field, the guys that have to know everything, then the guys who are going to be managers one day. And David Ross already has managerial experience, and managerial experience is a big deal. And I don't know that the Braves, maybe you guys have a different opinion. I don't know that the Braves are going to go hire somebody for this job who's never managed at the major league level before. They could get somebody with some potential they like, but that's a tall task. And anybody that's got managerial experience like David Ross does, he obviously was with the Cubs, I'm going to put above anybody that does it. So like Weiss and David Ross are two names. Skip Schumacher, like Scott just said, was with the Marlins, had a successful year. A lot of people think he got a raw deal in Miami as well, just like Ross did in Chicago. Like, Scott said, he's already in Texas. Texas also has an opening. I would be very surprised if he's not the next manager of the Rangers. I think they got him in that job to be Bochy's heir apparent, because obviously Bochy is older than Snit, so he wasn't not going to be around for long. I'm guessing Schumacher is going to be the next guy in Texas. Ryan Flaherty is interesting. He's never managed, but he has been on a coaching staff, and that's the next best thing. If you've never managed, at least you've been around a clubhouse for 6 months. You see what it takes. Like, I think you should at the very least have been a coach on a major league staff to be considered for this job. Even if you're not a manager, I think you should at least have been a coach. I'll say this, and I'll let Scott jump back in here. One thing I haven't seen, and if Steven Tolbert was running the search and I got to just imprint the thing that I value the most, I've already said experience. The next thing I would do, honestly, is I'm not sure I would hire a coach in 2025 that can't speak English and Spanish. I think I would want a bilingual head. There's just so many Latin players in baseball.
Oh, yeah.
It's the language barrier thing is a big deal, especially when you've got to be around people for 6 or 7 months, and having guys who can speak both English and Spanish. Now I get guys on staffs, every staff has a guy who can speak Spanish, but I would have a hard time if it was me running, if I was running a search, hiring a guy who doesn't speak both English and Spanish. But there's not a lot of those guys. I mean, that you limit your pool even more if you do that. So,
Yeah.
I could see any one of these guys get in. I could see somebody we haven't talked about that we will never talk about interviewing and getting it. It is going to be fascinating. But if I'm setting betting lines today, David Ross is who I'm going with.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I'm fascinated to hear what names we're going to hear in the next couple of weeks, what gets leaked, what doesn't. Of course, the Braves run a very tight ship. So I will say I agree wholeheartedly with having a bilingual manager, or at least someone who can really connect with the Latin players. The other thing too, which I think is a high priority, and they don't have to be a computer science major who can stare at a spreadsheet for 9 hours and break it all down, but someone who is at least embracing of modern analytics, who understands bullpen leverage, who understands how to manage a pitching staff come October. That's important. And I'm sure of all the names, that's going to be something that gets brought up in the interview process. It's going to be a strength for some. I don't think it needs to be the strength. Like I don't think Alex Anthopoulos, as much as he talks about the importance of a strong clubhouse and everybody getting along and being with each other every single day for 190 days out of the year, I don't think Alex is going to overlook the kind of personal side of the game. But I do think if we could have Alex with True Serum on the show tonight, he would say that somebody who is at least open and embracing of analytics and how the modern baseball game is played is something that needs to be included. Otherwise, it's going to feel like we're kind of getting left in the dark a little bit.
Yeah. And that's 100% true. I would also say that the thing that made Snitker so good was that he could accomplish what he accomplished in spite of that. And there is kind of this like, do you want the traditional manager that's old school but has the respect of the players? Do you want the new school manager? Who was it? Kapler with the Philly. Gabe Kapler. Yeah. It kind of it can also go off the rails if you're not careful. It's such a delicate thing. I'm glad I'm not out. I'm glad I'm not the one that has to make this call, because like merging the old school like traditions and like respect and the new school, it's a tough needle to thread. And I agree with you though. That was Brian's biggest blind spot, and it would be nice to finally fill that gaping hole that's been in the organization the last decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to become even more important now for that attention to detail and that ability to be knowledgeable about, the strategic points of the job, of where to add value in the moment in games, how to be on top of that nonstop, adding value that way. It's going to become even more important as we try to piece together this roster, a roster right now that has a bit more uncertainty about it than it did a few years ago. But we're going to dive a little bit more into these names in just a moment after another word from our partners.
Okay, AJ, our slab pack ripping continues now. You just ripped a card that I think you're actually going to keep.
I am. I'm going to keep it. It's a Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card. The old, isn't this the famous upper deck one? I believe it is. And yeah, heck yeah, I'm going to keep it because I'm going to get Griffey to sign it. I'm going to get him to send it to me, which you can do, and I'm going to get Griffey to sign it, and it's only going to make it worth more. So I am all in on this card. I'm keeping it, and it is one of the coolest cards with the highest turtleneck you've ever seen and the gold chain around his neck.
Graded 9, 1989 upper deck. You get the offer for $179. It's valued at around $199. And you're like, nah, I'm keeping it. But if you wanted to sell it back instantly, you can. It's the beauty of Arena Club. AJ is going to send in and get the physical card sent to him. And you could do the same. 20% off your first slab pack or card purchase can happen for you if you go to arenaclub.com/foul and use the code FOUL.
So, guys, we talk about some of the names that we've mentioned, and I think that all of those names that we've heard, mentioned, through different reports and things like that today, each makes sense in their own right. I agree. David Ross stands out as a sensible name. I would put him and Walt Weiss probably in that upper tier above others. I also want to point out that, some other names were thrown out there, maybe from a fan speculation or, outside the box, if you will, names that I don't necessarily think probably make the most sense for the Braves. I know that, for instance, a Travis d'Arnaud, is someone that people have mentioned. It should be mentioned, of course, that he's still under contract playing wise when it comes to the Angels. But I do want to point out that I know that some other organizations have even had success going to get former players who did not have any managerial experience really at any level before they took over the job for an organization. I don't think that makes sense for the Braves. Just like I don't think, for instance, Tony Vitello from the University of Tennessee, go Vols, but who comes from the University of Tennessee, I don't think that that's someone that really makes sense for the Braves, because you're not looking to bring in someone to just completely change the culture and bring needed energy to the organization to try to help build a successful restart or rebuild. That's not the case here. That's why when we talk about managerial experience or coaching experience, a proven track record, I think, is a really big trait that you want in the manager of the next Braves. But we talk so much about who the Braves are going to hire, who's going to be in that spot. And yes, again, it's the right time to make a change in that spot. But Scott, we'll start with you, and Stephen, get your opinion on this as well. What about the remaining of the coaching staff? Stephen, I know that you talk about the fact that we may have to see a big part of that coaching staff replaced, but there's also reason to want some of that continuity to remain. Rich Kranitz has consistently gotten more than expected from this pitching staff, even this year with having to put together a makeshift rotation and bullpen at times. Tim Hires, he implemented needed areas of improvement for this lineup as the season went along. I think that it would be more of a good thing than a bad thing to retain both of those guys. But how big of a part does that play in your overall expectation to retaining what seems to be a pretty good setup coaching-wise, a pretty good successful setup when it comes to the supporting staff to a manager?
So I think for me, the priority is keeping Rick Kranitz around. If Kranitz is down to keep going, I'm all for it. Braves pitching has been really good, and they've developed young pitching well. That one to me is kind of a no-brainer. If Kranitz is in, and I will say Kranitz is getting a little bit older, he also had a family issue a couple years ago that kept him away. Don't want to speculate on that stuff, but if Kranitz is in, I am in for 2026. Tim Hires, man alive. I mean, it was so bad in the first half. The Braves did hit better as the season went along. Part of me says it's kind of like an offensive coordinator in football. If you change him every year, you're kind of starting back at zero. But if the results aren't what you want, it's kind of an easier decision to make. I could probably be talked either way on Tim Hires, but if they say we're going to move on, I would not lose sleep over it by any means. And then, I mean, the rest of the coaching staff, I'd love to have Eddie Perez around just for the vibes. Eddie's, of course, a Braves lifer and a legend. We'll see what he ultimately wants to do. But that's, I mean, for the coaching staff, that's kind of it. I think it's keep Kranitz if he's in. We'll see what they ultimately do with Hires. And if Eddie Perez wants to come back, great. But, Tom Goodwin at first base, whatever. Freddie Gonzalez at third base. It's still funny that they had to make that change mid-season because it was so bad. And Freddie was good at third base. So maybe the new manager, whoever it is, will be down to have, oh, God, surely they wouldn't even think about Freddie Gonzalez for 2 seconds, right? Right. The other name, and then I'll throw it to you, Stephen. Are we all in agreement that we want no part of Mark DeRosa?
Yeah, so that was going to be so Mark has zero managerial experience outside of the WBC, and I don't count the WBC because it's a glorified all-star team. You're together for like 3 weeks. Yeah. You deal with none of the stuff that real managers have to deal with. The whole thing is, can you keep a team together over 6 months? And there's just no way to recreate that over 3 weeks with what is basically an all-star team. So I don't count that at all. He's also not been a coach. Like, he's not even been on like a coaching staff. He's also said some pretty crazy things about the Braves the last couple of years. He's on MLB Network. They do segments. They've got to get clicks and engagements. And I understand, like, he probably embellishes some stuff to get reaction, but like, he came out and said like the Braves weren't as good because they all got paid and that they don't care as much. Like, stuff that's pretty insulting of a clubhouse, if I'm being quite honest. I don't know how welcome he would be. So yeah, I have zero interest in Mark DeRosa.
DeRosa was also one of the multiple, I believe, who was like, "Hey, maybe the Braves are fine without Ronald Acuna Jr."
He's
What are we
he's
doing
railed
here?
against Acuna a couple. Yeah, I have the managerial experience alone would disqualify him for me. But even if that wasn't the case, I have no interest with him. The coaching staff is like, because everybody wants to know about Ron Washington. Listen, Ron Washington is older than Snit. He just had a quadruple bypass surgery. There's no way in hell this guy needs to be managing a baseball team next year. But if Ron Washington came and said, like, hey, I can't manage, but I kind of want to do something. I want to go back to being your infield coach or one of your base coaches. Like, hell yeah, sign me up for that. It's much less stress. You're not the one dealing with the media every day. You're not the one making out the lineup. You're not the one, getting bombarded with questions. It's a much less stressful job. So if he wants to do that, if he wants to get back on the staff in some way, sign me up. He has no business being manager though. Freddie, I thought Freddie did a good job when he came over for third base. I have no idea what they're going to do with Tim Hires. I thought mid-season, I thought for sure they were going to fire. I thought they might fire him like June. It was going so poorly for a while. But the offense did turn it around in the second half. Might have saved his job. You really don't want to have to replace your hitting coach twice in 2 years. It's not really the sign of stability that the Braves typically look for. But Scott is 1,000% right. The most important part of this conversation is you have to find a way to keep Rick Kranitz. That guy gets the very most out of whatever his talent level is at any given time, whether it's Chris Sale and Spencer Swellenbach or it's, Hurston Waldrop and Joey Wentz. Whatever his talent level is, he gets the most out of it. And I don't know what their individual contract situations are. I don't know how tied they were to specifically Snit, but you got to, I think the number one, you have to try to keep Rick Kranitz if you can. I don't even know if he has any interest in managing. Probably not. I'm sure he'd be happy to stay as the pitching coach. I know the manager who you hire will probably want to have a say in who his pitching coach is going to be. But if it's possible, I would love to keep Rick Kranitz.
And I also think that it's worth noting that, if you were the more of that staff that you were to keep, like if you bring a Ron Washington on, if you were to retain a Freddie Gonzalez, if you were to retain a Rich Kranitz, that probably makes you more comfortable with potentially bringing in someone that you really like that doesn't have that managerial experience. If through these interviews and a name that we haven't even mentioned comes to light and really makes an impact in their interview with AA and whoever, the hiring, group is, if you retain so many of those sources that you trust and do have experience, that could be what positions you to go after someone who may be more of a dark horse type candidate, things such as that. And again, Scott, we mentioned those names that, could, potentially be on a list that we're not thinking of right now. One other thing to consider in this, it's not really a wild card. It's true about Alex Anthopoulos. He is someone that puts a lot of value on his relationships, and he is very loyal to those that he's worked with in the past. I don't necessarily mean that means he's going to hire someone that he's had extensive connections with, but I do think that means that where he's going to talk, that's where names will come from that we may not have mentioned. But when we talk about connections, that is very important. It's important to go with guys that but it all comes back to this one thing. It comes back to why Steven is talking about a bilingual coach, someone that may be able to connect better in terms of communication with Latin American players and things like that. This coach has to prove without a doubt that when they go into the clubhouse, you are very confident that they are going to gain that respect of the players that was so prevalent with Snit. And they may have to do it in different ways. But that above all has to be what stands out. If you put value on past managerial experience to see that, that's fine, but that's what has to stand out. You've got to get a guy who can connect well with the clubhouse, because that's been such a pivotal part of what's been successful for us in recent past.
And I think it's a virtual guarantee that is going to be a large part of Alex Anthopoulos' decision. John, you did a great job interviewing Kevin Pillar the other night, and Pillar kind of reinforced some of the things we've heard about Alex and just how much he cares about the clubhouse and asking players about teammates and, hey, how is this guy? Or you can be rest assured that no matter who he ultimately hires, the homework will be done. And if there's any real doubt, at least in my opinion, if there's any real doubt about who the person is not in the dugout and his ability to command a clubhouse and keep everybody together for 7 or 8 months at a time, I think that's probably more disqualifying than any other thing that they're going to talk about in the interview.
And I'll say this, that's also why front offices don't just stick like one of their analytical guys down in that spot. In the modern game, the front office kind of decides a lot of the strategic part of the game. They decide, they have input on the lineup, they have input on the bullpen usage. And so people have asked, well, if you're going to control that much of it, why don't you just put one of your front office people in the dugout to be the manager? And the reason you don't do that, the reason you do not do that is because the players have to know and respect the person in that spot to get them to play hard for 7 months. You cannot just stick an empty suit that they don't know, that they never heard of, that never played or has never managed. There's no reason for them to respect them. That is how you lose a clubhouse like instantaneously. And that's why I think managerial experience matters, or that you've played, you've been on a staff, you have something that these players can look to and say, all right, he's done this. I can respect that. I don't always agree with what he says, but he's been here. He's done this. It's why it's usually former players. It's why it's usually guys who have come up through the ranks. You very rarely just see just a out of nowhere hire for a manager, because the respect factor is too big a deal. And it's every bit a deal in this search, because especially with the guy you're replacing, that has to, like Scott said, that has to be the main thing. It can't be a thing. That has to be the main thing.
And I want to end with this on my end, is that it's a time to also be excited, right? Like, not because of the fact that Snitker is no longer the manager, that he should be celebrated, praised, get all the adulation that he deserves. But it's a time where this is an opportunity to improve things. We've talked about it for more than a year now. Some things about the organizational approach to success that this organization has put in place for years, they have to change. The best way to implement that is making sure that you get the leader of your roster right. And I don't feel there's anybody who knows the importance of that more than Alex Anthopoulos, because he's had the biggest impact on building what has been successful, what has proven to be successful in years past, that he now needs to make successful to his expectations once again. So that gives me confidence that he not only is going to be thorough and, as we mentioned, exhaustive in this, I feel that means that he's going to get it right. And at the end of the day, maybe a name that we mentioned, may not, but at the end of the day, we're going to see that the name that he brings in is someone that he thoroughly vested, and someone that I feel will be the right move for this clubhouse, and hopefully will be a critical component to us getting back to the contention that we all know we want this team to be at. Scott, Steven, as we wrap up this edition of the Hammer Territory podcast, anything else from either of y'all?
Just a big day for the Atlanta Braves.
Yes.
And we all had a hunch that this was coming, but now it's real. And now it is a new era of Braves baseball. And we have not been able to say many times, and I mean, honestly, our lifetimes, that the Braves are looking for a new manager. It has been the pillar of consistency in Major League Baseball. And I'm excited for the future. I think you nailed it, Sean. It's an exciting time. Give Brian Snitker all the love and credit that he deserves. But let's go find a manager and let's get back to winning. Because I mean, boys, I put on a playoff game right now, and I am just so envious of just the passion and emotion. Not only get back to the playoffs, but let's get back to winning some playoff games. We've won 2 playoff games since winning the World Series. That's just not right. It should not be that way. Let's get a manager. Let's have a good, productive, fruitful offseason, and then let's get back to being where we want the Braves to be.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of that. It was already a fascinating offseason. We kind of assumed this was coming, and then we kind of assumed it might not come, and now it came. So now, not only is the roster up for debate and questions, now the manager and the entire coaching staff, quite frankly, is up. And so the one thing I will say is there's plenty of content coming, because we have now even more questions to this offseason. We are going to get probably weekly updates on this managerial search. We're going to get some answers on the coaching staff about what their contractual statuses are, what they're interested in, or are they interested in coming back. It's going to get very interesting. And like I said at the beginning of this, today is just the start of this process. I know it has some finality to it because somebody is leaving, but from the Braves perspective, this is day one of this process, and it's going to play out for, quite a bit of time going, through the World Series, and then the offseason starts in early November. But there's going to be quite a bit to talk about, so make sure you're following along.
And to put this in as maybe eye-opening a context as possible, We talk about the continuity of the Braves roster, who they have under contract and things like that. Guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Chris Sale may be the only Brave who has been alive since 1990 that's under contract through next year. He may be the only Brave who's been alive to have seen 3 Braves coaching searches in his lifetime. Pierce Johnson may be old enough, but again, we saw it in 2016, but the time before that was 1990. Excuse me. Let me take this back.
You confused the hell out of me with it.
I know. I'm sorry about that. The point that I'm getting at is that you see, this is again, the Braves have had 3 managers over the past 35 years. To put it into context, you see some teams who go through 3 managers in multiple seasons. So it is quite rare to see a Braves managerial search. That's why it's exciting to see for sure. Nothing else from Scott and Steven. Can't thank you enough for joining us here on the Hammer Territory podcast. We will be back tomorrow night after Alex Anthopoulos' comments when it comes to the Braves, the end of the season. Now, obviously, a managerial search. Plenty to watch out for tomorrow with his comments. We'll break it all down tomorrow. Can't thank you enough for joining us. Again, a salute to Brian Snitker. Great job on his career. Can't thank you enough. We'll talk to you again soon here on the Hammer Territory podcast.